At first light, when the frost still stitched the inner faces of the arrow slits with thin white seams, Winterfell breathed up its old warm mist from the belly of the springs. It lifted at the edges of the yard like a living thing, softening the angles of stone and softening, too, the edges of voices. The sound of a bucket chain clinking and the scrape of a broom under a window sounded farther away than it was, wrapped in the pale steam. A boy ran across the yard with a pail so full it yawned and slopped at each step. His breath came in faint white ribbons and vanished in the warmer air as if he were running straight from frost into summer. Arya rose before the torches guttered, a habit that had twined itself into her bones years ago, when dawn had so often been the only time she owned. She had left behind so many names that it astonished her that some habits remained stubborn as weeds. She could not sleep past the hour when sparrows began to fuss in the garden wall, and she could not pass an open courtyard without measuring the distance to its shadows. The firs had been warm and heavy. The quiet had been the particular deep quiet of a large house in winter, a quiet that seemed to carry weight. She lay for the space of a dozen breaths, listening to it, listening to the sleeping pace of the keep, counting heartbeats the way her first swordmaster had insisted one must count if one meant to become quick. Then she swung her legs out and set her feet on the old flagstones. They held the day's heat long after the sun went, and they surrendered it slowly in the night. Another of Winterfell's secrets that had kept her family alive longer than anyone had a right to survive in the north. On the chair by the bed her clothing lay neatly folded. She had made a habit of that too, though at first it had been a discipline forced upon her by the woman who had dressed queens. Since then, it had softened into something that needed no watcher. She shrugged into wool and leather and pulled her hair back without a mirror. The hair had grown again, thick and the dark of night ravens, and it curled at the ends if she let it, a stubborn memory of girlhood that would show itself in damp weather. She finger-combed it into a tail and bound it with a strip of plain cloth, then fastened the gray cloak at her throat with a brooch shaped like a running direwolf. The metal was cold as river water for a breath and then warmed to her touch. The keys hung beside the door in their loop of leather, heavy with their knowledge of hinges. She did not carry them when she walked alone. There was a kind of feeling she preferred to keep for the mornings, a feeling that did not go well with weight around the waist. As Lady of Winterfell, a title that fit like an old boot found in the ashes, reluctantly tried on because the snows had come and there were no other boots. She wore the keys when the day required them, when decisions needed locks and locks needed decisions. Before that, before the counting and the speaking, she wanted a piece of the place that had been hers before it had expected knowledge of ledgers and bread ovens. She eased the door open and stepped into the corridor. The torches in their brackets were guttering, and the small flame left cast soft, skipping shadows against the curve of stone. Her footsteps in their soft boots made almost no noise. She often tested herself. Another old habit. Move without making a sound. Move without unsettling the mice in the wall. It was a children's game that had become the game of staying alive, and then, somehow, had become simply the way she moved in all places. She could not remember the exact breath when it had changed. Most things did not change in a breath. By the time she reached the passage that led down toward the godswood, the steam had gathered thicker about her knees. It had a smell that always surprised her, as if it could be scented, something like wet iron and long-decayed leaves. The guards nodded as she passed. She had learned their names and the tilt of their smiles and the temper of their horses, because it mattered and because learning people had once been a matter of survival. Lon was on duty in the passage, a man with a scar like a pale feather along his jaw, and he shifted his weight just enough to let her know he had seen her. Even when people said nothing, everything about them spoke. She never forgot that. The godswood held winter as if winter had nowhere else to be. Snow clung to the branches as if it had crawled there and meant to stay, and the air beneath the pines was stiller than the air outside, as if the trees enforced their own law. The heart tree at the center watched with its red eyes and red mouth. In summer it smelled of sap and leaves and something older than either. In winter, if she pressed her palm to it, she could feel a slow pulse deep in the wood that was not her own. Once, long ago, she had pressed her ear to it and listened and thought she had heard water moving in the stone below. She went to it now through the crunch of light snow and knelt the way her father had knelt, the way he had knelt on days when he had faced crowds or silence. Kneeling had never been easy for her. It felt like putting down a sword when enemies were too quick to see you unarmed. And yet there were times when kneeling was not surrender. It was remembering you were smaller than the thing you addressed, and that the size had value. She rested her hand on the bark. It felt rough and cold and wet, and she did not speak aloud. Instead, she made a small inventory of the world inside her. Needle was tucked in the drawer beneath the window that looked out on the inner yard, wrapped in oiled cloth, near enough to reach in her sleep. Her breathing was slow. The air was so cold that it seemed to have edges and to enter with delicate nicks. She was thinking of the granaries. Their east wall had needed new mortar in 3 places, and the mason had told her yesterday that if the snow turned to sleet, she would have a leak. She was thinking of the roof of the glass gardens, and the way the panes had fogged and stayed fogged for a week now because some of the channels that carried the warmer water had clogged. She was thinking, too, of the letter that had come 2 days ago from a man who signed his name with a reed drawn as a crossbar. She had read the letter 3 times, and each time it had said more than its words, as if the ink had meaning that did not lie flat on the page. She thought of Sansa, because she had a way of thinking of her sister in the mornings when the world was quiet. The memory was no longer a sharp thorn. It had worn into the shape of something a finger could touch without bleeding. She could see Sansa's hands smoothing a bit of frayed ribbon, and the way her hair had shone when the light found it. She imagined Sansa's laugh when pleased and the small line between her brows when she thought herself alone. The line that meant she was carrying 8 thoughts and was not sure which were hers and which belonged to what others wanted. Sansa had been meant to be lady. Even when they were small, the house itself seemed to have shaped itself in quiet expectation of Sansa's step. Arya had resisted that. Resisted by running, by climbing, by wearing breeches under her padded skirts and not caring when the ladies of the keep sighed. And yet the keys had found her, their weight pressed into her palm with the quiet insistence of necessity. If she had waited, someone else would have come for them. If she had run, someone else would have claimed them. She did not believe in fates that were written, but she believed that sometimes a place would choose. Winterfell had a long memory. It had recognized something in her that was not temperament or gentleness or the smooth way of receiving people at a table, but something harder to name. A refusal to abandon a thing that needed holding, even if the holding bruised the skin. She breathed again and let the cold bite the inside of her nostrils until it hurt just enough to feel like waking. Then she stood, pressed her palm to the heart tree one last time, and went back along the path toward the yard. Steam had thickened there. The boy with the bucket had become 2 boys with buckets, and an old woman was scolding them that eggs would not come in any faster for being shouted at. Workers crossed the yard with armloads of kindling. A butcher's apprentice hurried by with the morning's meat wrapped in linen. And above it all, the ravens roused themselves, shifting and speaking in short, impatient clacks. She lifted her head to listen. On another morning, in another place, she might have read omens in their conversation. In Winterfell, it meant letters. The kitchen girls would be pulling bread from the ovens in another few minutes, and the house would begin to rouse itself fully, and she would need to be in the hall to hear what was needed of her and to say what needed to be said. In the great hall, the rushes had been changed the night before, and a handful of fir sprigs cut from the edge of the gods' wood had been scattered among them. The scent was clean, the kind of clean that made a person think they had done something right by the simple act of breathing. Fires leapt in the long hearth and along the smaller cradles of flame under kettles and spits, and the old stones drank the heat with contentment. The tables would fill in slow waves. First the kitchen and laundry workers eager to gulp their porridge and run. Then the guards off night watch with their careful, exhausted glances. Then the craft folk who could afford to linger a little and talk. The high table was not her favorite place, but there were duties that did not ask whether they were favorite or not. Maester Remy's was already there, his gray robes folded around him like a drawn-up tide. He had thin hair and a thin mouth and eyes that were not thin at all, but round with curiosity that had not yet gone to sourness. One day it might. She had known men who had lived their whole lives as if their minds were knives they could never sheath. Remy's was not like that, not yet. He liked things too much, liked the feeling of a good binding on a book and the crisp way parchment folded, liked the oddities of mushrooms and the patterns on feathers. He had once shown her a feather under his glass and said look, and she had looked, and the barbs and barbules had seemed like a city drawn there in miniature. Letters, he said without preface, lifting his hand as if to show he did not traffic in rumor when he could traffic in ink. 2 last night, 1 this morning, and the boy brought word there might be another before the porridge is gone. Who's awake this early to trouble ravens? She asked, pulling off her gloves and pushing them into her belt. Someone in White Harbor who cannot sleep when the wind is from the north, Remy's answered. Lord Manderly's steward or his maester, or Lord Manderly himself who has seen a shadow against the moon and fears it is a sail. One never knows. The second is from Deepwood Motte. And the first was sent yesterday from the Neck. She took the cup that a girl pressed into her hand and drank. It was small beer flavored with a slice of dried apple and tasted better than it should have for something so humble. Steam fogged the edge of her vision and cleared. The Neck, she said. Is it from Reed's? Remy's expression changed by the smallest degree. He liked his puzzles to announce themselves slowly. It seemed a courtesy between puzzle and solver. The seal is a fish with a crown of reeds. Howland Reed's folk always did like their jokes. Not a joke, Arya said, and set the cup on the table. Where is it? Remy's unrolled it carefully, and she took it before he could comment on the thickness of the parchment or the dryness of the ink. She did not require his gloss today. The letter was shorter than she expected. It said, there was a thaw where there should not be one, that the frogs sang earlier than they should and then were silent, that a man had gone in to cut winter reeds and had come out with white streaks in his hair and a story he would not tell. It said that if the Lady of Winterfell kept any memory of the old ways, she might wish to send ears that would hear what birds would not tell and eyes that would not trust the surface of a thing. It did not say please. It did not need to. She looked down at the words and then, without meaning to, at her hands. They were her hands and not her hands at once. They had the ridges and scars she knew. The thin line across the first knuckle of her right hand where she had overreached with needle and had been punished by a blade not meant to cut her. And they had, too, the small traces of a life she had once thought she would never live. There was a crease where the key leather rubbed sometimes, and a faint notch where the corner of a ledger had made itself known. She had a moment then, small and tight in the center of her, in which she almost laughed. The world would never stop placing old marks on new skin. Deepwood Motte asks for ironmongers. Remy's went on when she did not speak. The way a man who deals in words will go on to the next set of words when the first proves to have too many edges. They've had a failure of something in their forges, damp, most likely. And White Harbor wants to know if the winter roads are passable enough to trust a shipment inland without losing said shipment to wolves or bandits or both. Both, Arya said. In winter, there's always both. We can spare 2 smiths for Deepwood. Send them with the men who'll take the last of the barley to Widow's Watch. As for White Harbor, tell them the eastern road is passable between here and Barrowton with caution. Past that, they should send men who know how to sleep lightly. And tell them we'll send one of ours to ride ahead and look for places where the drifts have laid traps. Remy's nodded, tapping the edge of the parchment with his forefinger as if to measure the surety in her voice. He did that too. It had annoyed her at first, that gesture that seemed to weigh words against an old scale only he could see. She knew now that he could not help himself. And the Neck? He asked gently. The Neck? Arya said. She folded the letter carefully and set it beside her cup. We will send someone who can move quietly and who will not be frightened off by old stories told to children. Someone who knows which stories are for children and which ones are meant for men. Remy's waited, and when she did not immediately speak, he permitted himself the smallest smile. You mean to go? I mean to be lady today, Arya said. And today the lady will decide who goes. After that, perhaps she will let someone else decide for a day. She did not smile with the joke. He did not take offense without a smile to show her it was one. The steward arrived then. Tamsin of the tall shoulders and the careful hands. She had served 3 lords before Arya and had outlived all of them in patience. Arya had never once seen her spill anything, including her temper. She came with a slate and chalk and a sharp eye, and her hair was bound in a knot so severe it kept the lines of her face in good order. "The south wall of the east granary," she said, pausing only long enough to incline her head in respect. "Master Hal might be ready to weep. The mortar crumbles if you look at it and refuses to accept its replacement. He's put poor Joss up on a ladder 3 times in the night, and by the time Joss reaches the ground with the last scrape of trowel, the bit near the stairs starts to go to dust again. He says the warmth inside and the cold outside are fighting, and he only has 2 hands. The warmth inside and the cold outside have been fighting since the first stone," Arya said. "We'll not solve their argument this morning, but we can put a man beneath ladder to steady it and another to fetch Joss down before he breaks his head. Tell Hal I'll come look before the noon meal." Tamsin inclined her head a fraction. She appreciated swift answers the way some people appreciated music. "And there's a woman from Wintertown who is so angry she might set her cloak on fire when she puts it down. She says her neighbor's goats have eaten her winter cabbages and that he sets them in her garden on purpose because she has no man in the house and he thinks a widow is another word for field. She wishes for justice and for his ears." "We won't be taking ears," Arya said, "but we will listen. Bring them after I've seen the granary. And have someone put her cloak on a peg out of reach of the hearth. The mason also says the west tower's inner steps have settled and the 3rd stair from the bottom will break an ankle if we don't pry it up today." Tamsin went on with tireless precision. "And cook says we've gone and promised the men off duty meat pies and pickle with their noon meal as if pickles grow on our trees in deep winter. And the last of the summer cucumbers were eaten 3 days ago. Pickles don't grow on trees even in midsummer," Arya said, and Tamsin's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly with approval that the Lady of Winterfell knew such things. "Tell cook to give them onions in vinegar if he must call it pickle, and to slice them thin so it looks like more." Tamsin made the chalk sing on the slate. "And you have promised to watch the lads in the training yard this morning. The lads have told everyone they will be watched and will be unbearable if they are not. If you wish to avoid that, you should not have promised them you would watch their footwork." Arya tried not to smile. She had grown too much into this role to let smiles be coins that any ear might pick from the floor. But the thought of their eager faces, all proud and awkward, all elbows and bones, and the certainty that any day they would grow taller than a lord warmed her. She had been a child who had wanted someone to notice her footwork. She had noticed it for herself, and then others had, and then too many had, but not the ones she had wanted to look. There would always be people who looked at a girl and saw what they expected. It was, perhaps, the only time in a day when she forgot entirely to be careful. "I promised," she said, "and I keep promises made to children. The rest can wait until after their arrogance has been fed properly." Remy's shifted, the parchment in his fluted sleeves whispering. "There is also a man in the yard who says he once carried messages between your father and the hill clans. He has not given his name. His hat is too large and he does not take it off when he speaks. He says his feet are cold and he would like a place by the fire, but not one where people will notice him." "Then he has chosen the wrong keep," Arya said. "There is no place in Winterfell where people are not noticing. Give him a stool near the hearth along the west wall, and see that his feet are put in a pan of warm water whether he thinks it ruins his dignity or not. When I have finished with children and goats and stairs that break ankles, I will listen to the man about hills. And the ravens," Remy's reminded her gently. "If a 4th comes before noon, I shall grow unbearable until I have shown it to you. Then let us put off a 4th raven as long as we can," she said, and finally allowed the corner of her mouth to lift. The morning made itself, as mornings do when not prevented by weather or men with swords. The boys in the yard were already assembled when she crossed its flagstones. She had left the cloak in the hall, and the air bit her cheeks enough to bring color into them even before the first boy took a tumble. They were of an age she could not look at without remembering, because it was the age a person is just before the world begins to tell them no in the loud voice it reserves for people who seem to be in a hurry. Their feet were too large or too small for their legs, and their mouths were full of teeth that had not settled, and they were terribly serious about things that did not yet require seriousness. That seriousness was a blessing. It made them careful. It would later become pride. Her work was to bend seriousness into care and, later, pride into responsibility. Blade work is not blade work, she told them. "If your feet go into the ground and get lost, you will look very fine for the first 2 strokes, and then you will be lying on your back and your enemy will be looking at the sky and wondering whether it will snow." The smallest boy, he could not yet have seen 10 winters, looked up at the sky as if to check. His hair was so fair it might have been white had he been older. His name was John o' the Mill, and his father had come south when the ice had closed the river, and they had run through their stores faster than he had promised his wife they would. The boy's father carried sawdust in the lines of his knuckles and had asked for work and gotten it. The boy had asked for training and gotten that as well. "What should we stand on, my lady?" John asked with sincere interest. "If not the ground, stand on a thought," Arya said, "and keep it just where your balance is." They laughed because they could not help it. She was not one for making children stand in silence as if they were polished stones. A laugh is balance too, well-timed. She thought once of Sirio, of the way he had said "you are a sword and the world is water," and then showed her how to prove it. She taught the boys to make lines on the floor with the chalk from the stores, pale white strips that caught the dust and the damp, and to keep their bare feet on one line and then 2, practicing turns and small adjustments, practicing the art of never letting weight grow so heavy in one foot that it became a root. She corrected them with a light hand and a tone as if she were asking them whether they meant to walk all the rest of their lives like ducks. In an hour, they were moving better. In 2, they were laughing less and then laughing more and then not at all, because laughter takes strength too. By the end of the 2nd hour, she was flushed and would have liked to take her own cloak to the godswood and lie on the new snow and let it take some of the heat from her. But that was for a girl who had time. The lady had goats to address and steps to pry up and a man with a hat too large to listen to. The woman from Wintertown was as Tamsin had described her. Wrapped in anger like a second cloak, hair escaping from her cap as if it, too, wished to fly at her neighbor. Her name was Alice, and her garden had been fenced with stakes scavenged from broken barrels and a length of chain that someone had not missed until too late. The neighbor had come with his hat in both hands, and the expression men wear when they are sure if they look properly regretful they will escape with a fine instead of a beating. His goats were tethered outside the hall, chewing in a state of goat innocence that in any other animal would be considered insolence. Arya listened to them both until the words the man had prepared fell away, and his voice came up from his belly in the shape it took when a person stopped pretending they were not ashamed. "She's right," he said finally, ducking his head as if that might keep the words from hitting him as they came out. "I thought to put them to her cabbages when my own were gone. I thought that because she is alone the wolves will not come if I tie my goats at her fence. I meant to take them away before dawn and I did not. And the snow came in and then my boy was not well and I sent my girl to fetch them and she came back with her fingers blue and the goats were inside her gate with their heads busy where hers should have been. I am sorry, my lady." "Sorry is a word that weights the tongue but does not feed a person," Arya said evenly. "You will give her 2 goats and not the worst of them, and you will come at noon to the training yard and dig a trench that runs from the drain by the smithy to the south yard, so that when the thaw comes the water runs where we wish it and not where it will. You will do that for 2 days. And Alice will come to the kitchens and tell cook what coppers she spent planting onions last spring, and he will give her as many onions as her coppers would have bought if foolish men had not eaten cabbages they did not plant." Alice's jaw worked once, twice, as if chewing a word too large for her mouth. "A goat," she said. Her eyes had grown shiny. 2 goats. 2 goats, Arya said. "And if they are sick or old, I will know it." The man who had lost his goats and kept his shame nodded until he looked a bit like a goat himself, all bobbing and penitent. The laugh that ran through the edge of the hall was not unkind. Arya let it pass. People needed their laughter where they found it. She watched Tamsin write the decision on her slate and then looked past Tamsin's shoulder to where a boy hovered in the shadow of the post. It was the same boy who had brought word of ravens, and he looked at her now with eyes too dark for such a pale face. "Another letter," he said when she tilted her head to show she saw him. "And a man at the west door asking for the lady in a voice that thinks it won't be given what it wants unless it asks twice." "Give the letter to the maester," Arya said. "The man will ask twice. Let him. Then bring him to me by the hearth. And find Lon. Tell him to stand by the west door with 2 more of our men until I say otherwise." The boy ran. He did not spill, though he had nothing in his hands to spill. He had the look of a boy who would not spill words either, and Arya stored the knowledge. It was the sort of thing that could be useful sooner than anyone knew. The man by the hearth was the man with the hat. It had been what Remy's had said. Too large, a hat that belonged to a head a decade and 2 growths ago. A hat that made his ears look like handles. He had put his feet into a pan of warm water with the affronted expression of a cat made to sit on wet grass. He had not removed the hat. His nose was red with cold. He had the look of the hills about him, not in his clothing, which could be mended anywhere men were poor, but in the way he settled his weight on the stool, the way he took the measure of each person who passed him as if counting how many there were and whether their hands were empty. "You're the lady," he said when she stood before him. He did not bother with titles beyond that. In the hills, titles were outlandish tunics people wore when they wished to be mistaken for someone else. "You're not the one they promised us, but you're the one we got." "I am the one you got," Arya said. She did not ask who had promised him what. The hills and the keep had longed for each other and disappointed each other in equal measure since the first stones brought warmth to one and refused it to the other. "Do you have a name to give?" "No," he said, and his mouth cracked with the beginning of a smile and then closed on it. "But I have a story to sell." "I don't buy stories," Arya said. "I take them and give what I think they're worth afterward. Like milk at the door." He found the smile again and let it show this time. It made his face younger. "Fair then," he admitted. "You have men who say they are of the hill clans but who have not slept a night in the heather since they were boys. They carry your banners well enough, but they don't know the paths that matter. There are men up there who carry no banner at all and know the paths better than they know the names of their own uncles. Some of those men have begun to speak of a thing that is not a man and not an animal that comes down to the edge of their fires and then isn't there the moment they turn their heads. Then come back tomorrow and tell me the story again, and if you tell it the same way without adding any new bones or circles, I will give you your price and a little ammo. Re for the keeping of your tongue steady." He looked at her from beneath the brim and let the corners of his mouth lift. "A fair woman and a fair bargain are a danger to men," he observed. "We will come again tomorrow. I will not change a word." "We?" she asked mildly. He tilted his head toward the west door where Lon stood with 2 men whose faces were less interested than they pretended. "There is always a we," he said, and that too was true. She went to look at the granary and stood in the cold with her breath making ghosts and watched Master Hal mutter at the wall as if it had betrayed him. Joss came down the ladder with his teeth clattering, swearing that he would go there and lean his shoulder against the crack and hold it shut by sheer strength until spring. She laughed and he laughed, and then he slipped because laughter makes the feet lighter and then less careful, and she caught the ladder and steadied it, and in that moment she was 16 again and climbing in the dark across places that could not bear a girl's weight. She held the ladder until his feet were sure, and then she ran her palm along the crumbling mortar and told Hal that she would send a man to the hot springs and another to the cold river, and they would bring back 2 buckets, and he would mix mortars from both and lay them together and let the wall choose which one it wanted. He snorted and said he did not take orders from women who thought walls had opinions, and she said he had been giving walls opinions since he grew his first whisker. He stopped snorting and then he obeyed. After that it was the stairs in the west tower, and the third from the bottom did indeed sulk when they pried it up the way a tooth sulks when pulled. Beneath it was damp, and something had nested there and left the scraps of an old blanket and the smell of mice. She sent 2 lads with straw and a broom and one with mint from the dried stores and told them to sweep and then grind the mint between their forefingers until its smell wrestled the mice in one. She felt the rise and fall of the keep in her bones the way a mother feels a baby's breathing under her hand. In the kitchens, Bessa was stirring a pot of onions and vinegar with a spoon big enough to scratch the back of a man too cowardly to itch himself, and she had the look of someone who believes in miracles because she has managed them before. The onions would not be a miracle, but they would be the thing promised under another name, and that is a magic as old as hunger. By the time she returned to the hall, the light had shifted to a cleaner white, and the frost on the inner sides of windows had melted into trails that moved like writing. The men off duty came in with snow stuck to their boots and their shoulders and shook it off in the entry like dogs. 3 women with baskets of knitting took their places near the smaller fire and watched the world like cats on a wall. The ravens spoke again. Remy's came forward with the fourth letter in his long thin hands. He held it as if it might fall apart if he looked away. "This one is from White Harbor as well," he said. "And the ink is smeared. The scribe does not know his own haste." "Read," Arya said, though she could read it herself, though she would read it herself after. He did, and the words crawled out like cold. Rumors of sails to the east that bore no colors and did not come close enough to count the men aboard. A trader who had lost 3 casks to a sudden tilt in the water though the sea had been calm. A child who claimed she had seen a fish with a face like a man. Arya let herself breathe out slowly, so that no one would think the winter had put its hand around her throat. "What do we have that we can move?" she asked Tamsin. 2 casks of lamp oil and a brace of crossbow bolts," Tamsin said without being asked why she had that answer ready. She always had some answer ready for half the questions Arya had not yet voiced. "And a man from the 3rd farm on the Greywater who knows boats better than he knows walking. Send the bolts to White Harbor with a letter that says we will send more when we have more," Arya said. "And send the man to White Harbor as well if he will go. Pay his wife from the petty chest every 7th day he is away. And write the harbor that they should not let the child's words run through the city like spilled honey. There's nothing like honey for gathering flies. There is word from Barrowton too," Remy's added, just as carefully. "Not a letter, a person. A woman who says she was traveling with 3 others and now she travels alone. She has been given bread and the smaller fire. She swallows her words as if they will choke her if she does not. Bring her," Arya said. "Bring anyone who swallows words to me. I have time for that." The woman was not older than Arya by more than a handful of years. Her hair was the color of dry grass and her hands were cracked as if she had washed them in sand. She carried herself as if the burden she had left behind still hung from her shoulders, and she looked at the floor until Arya spoke her name. She did not have to ask it. The woman had said it to Tamsin twice in the kitchen, and the sound of a name said in fear carries. Her name was Maddie. "I had a husband and 2 brothers who thought they were wolves," she said when the bread had warmed her and the small beer had put color back in her mouth. "They were not wolves, my lady. They were men and not clever ones. We set out for the East Road, thinking there would be work or food or something that was not hunger. We walked for 2 days and 2 nights with little to eat. On the 3rd day we came to the place where the trees thin and the road dips before the bridge. There was a man there crouched by the ditch with his cloak over his head. I thought him asleep and would have left him to his sleeping. My husband said if a man sleeps on a road, he is not worried about who might take his purse and perhaps we'll be worried for him too." He touched the man's shoulder. The man was cold as iron and his eyes were open and he had no face. "No face?" Remy's asked, startled out of stillness. "No face?" she repeated evenly, as if the word itself were something she had put in her mouth and tested and found acceptable. "Not like a skull. Not like something with the skin torn off it. His face had smooth skin on it as new as a babe's. No eyebrows, no hair, no mouth, no lines where a mouth should be, no nostrils." I cried out and one of my brothers put his hand over my mouth and said he had heard of this, that there were men from the south who learned to wear new faces like masks. He said he would take this one for his own, and then no one who had a reason to mark him would know him. He kept the cloak and we dragged the man into the ditch because my brother said it was unlucky to leave such a thing in the middle of the King's Road, though luck had not been with us anyway. We walked on until night and then my brother put his hand on my arm when I lay down and said that if I was not careful he would take me for his own as well and wear me like a coat. In the night I left them sleeping and I walked without stopping until the morning, and then I came here because once my mother stood in this hall and was given a bowl of something hot when she did not deserve it. That is all. If someone has grief in it, they can take their grief up with my brother. He will be on the East Road, boasting of his new face." Arya listened without moving. The skin on her back had prickled at the first mention of a man without a face. The prickle ran like a line of ants from shoulder to shoulder. She did not look toward the small chest near the window where a small sword and an old coin lay wrapped together. She did not say the words that rose, unwise and fierce, "I will go." Instead she said, in the slow voice a person uses when training their own face not to tell too much, "You have earned your bread, Maddie, and a place by the fire as long as your feet are near it. No one here wears anyone else like a coat. No one here will use you to frighten you further. Maddie's eyes filled, the way winter windows fill with melt. She pressed her lips together and nodded. And for a moment Arya saw past the cracked hands and into something that had been a girl once. Then she looked away before she saw herself there too. The day's light turned, as winter light does, from white to a faint thin gold that makes every shadow longer than truth and then lets it fall into blue. People came and went. Decisions were made in the small ordinary ways that keep a house upright. An extra stick on this side of the stool, a bit more straw in this pallet, a kettle swung closer to the flame. Arya walked through all of it the way she had learned to walk through cities, noticing the small things without letting them trip her. She answered a question about whether the ham should be sliced thin or thick with a question about how many mouths there were to feed, and then, when told, said what she had meant to say in the first place. Thin, today the ham would be thin and tomorrow it would be soup, and in that way 2 days could be made from one. She ordered wool to be cut for mitts for the men sent to Deepwood Motte, and she had Tamsin send a cask of beer to the masons because beer was smoother on the throat than gratitude and did not leave marks. At the second hour after noon she let herself go to her room and shut the door and lean, for the space of 3 breaths, against the solid wood and close her eyes. The room was quiet and smelled faintly of the lavender that had been laid in the chest in autumn, and of leather and oil. She crossed to the window. It looked out over the inner yard, and from it she could see the training yard's chalk line scuffed by bare feet, and beyond it, the faint plume that always rose from the godswood when the springs sent their breath up. She put her palm flat against the cold glass. It made a print there, a fog bloom shaped like a small leaf. She traced a line into it, the curve of a river she had once crossed with a single leap. The fog thinned and then was gone. She opened the chest and took up needle. The sword felt the way it always had, as if it were a part of her hand, as if her hand had been shaped around it and not the other way. She did not draw it fully. She did not need to. She lifted it and lowered it and then laid it back down as if she had set a sleeping child in among the blankets so that the child would not wake. She closed the chest and sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands. She told herself, as she had said she would in the godswood, that she would be lady today. Today the lady would not leave the keep with only a guard and a wolf and set her feet on the east road to find a man who wore a face that did not belong to him. Today the lady would write letters and choose men and send them out and wait for their return. The waiting had always been the hard part. It had been harder when she was a child. It had not grown easier, but it had grown possible. Knock, and Tamsin's voice carefully placed on the far side of respect. The man. She went down and stood in the white air beside the woman's old shawl, and she listened to an apple story that had a great deal to do with sheep if one only knew how to hear. She decided for the widow and then sent Jared to carry the sheep himself, because when men carry their own recompense their memories improve. The old woman said that the lady listened more like a carpenter than a lady, and Arya decided to take it as praise. By the time the kitchen smelled of meat pies that would be meat only if a person's memory had been good to them, the light had gone to ink and the torches had been lit and the mist rose thicker. She found herself on the battlements without entirely realizing she had set her feet there. Sometimes her feet went where they had always gone and she followed them, trusting. The wind was thin and sharp. It slid through seams in her clothing and found skin because it had always been a creature good at finding skin. She looked out over Winter Town, its roofs like hunched backs, its smoke like questions lifted to the sky. Beyond, the world was a series of paler and paler ghosts, fields, woods, distances named by those who had named them, now nearly indistinguishable one from another. There was movement at the gate, a small string of figures coming in out of blue dusk, no more than 2 or 3 wagons, no banners. A donkey. The guards called and were answered. Arya watched with the attention of someone who has learned that anything can turn into everything without notice. The first wagon rolled through, and then the second, and then a man with a fiddle on his back led the donkey and turned his head to look up at the battlement as if he knew someone stood there and his body knew where to look even if his eyes did not. He raised a hand. She did not know whether the gesture was for the lady or for the stone itself. She raised a hand back. He went on. The donkey's ears flicked. "A little troop," Lon said behind her. He had come quietly and made no pretense that he had not. players who have been playing for birds and donkeys and the Wind Moran people, I expect. They'll want a place to sleep and they'll want to tell us a story if we feed them. There's always one who wants to tell the lady something only she ought to hear. Let them, Arya said. I have heard a great many things and not nearly enough. She paused. Post extra men at the west and east gates tonight. Let them walk and talk so that their feet stay warm. Tell them that if anyone who enters does not wish to be seen, that is the person whose face they should memorize. And if anyone who enters wishes very much to be seen, that is the person whose belt they should notice. People who like to be seen often make sure their belts are new. He gave a small short laugh. It puffed in white from his mouth and was gone. As you say, my lady. And Lon, she added as he turned. If a raven comes after we have put out the candles, wake me. I would rather be woken than be told in the morning that the night has opinions. Yes, my lady, he said. His scar caught the torchlight when he turned his head and was for a moment as bright as a fresh-cut line in the snow. She stayed on the battlement a little longer. She let the cold be cold and the sky be sky. Somewhere in the yard a child cried and then stopped, persuaded by a familiar hand. Somewhere a door banged and then banged again because someone had not latched it properly and another someone had gone to see to it. Farther off, beyond the last roofline of Wintertown, a wolf called. It was not her wolf. That ache had quieted but not healed, and she had grown used to its weight. It was another wolf, some snow-gray thing that had found the forest good and the night a friend. She listened until the call became echo and then was nothing. When she came down, the troop had been given benches at the long table. They were 7. 2 men, 3 women, a lad with very wide ears, and the fiddler. The fiddler had set his bow on the table with exaggerated care, as if it were a piece of glass. The lad stared at the bread as if he were thinking of ways he might stuff whole slices into his mouth without his companions noticing. Tamsin had given them a firm glance and 2 pitchers of small beer and 5 bowls of the stew that the keep had always found a way to make no matter what was or was not in the pantry. They had eaten enough to remember their manners. When Arya entered, the fiddler stood and bowed very deeply and stepped on someone's foot. The woman whose foot he stepped on made no sound at all and therefore had the sort of mind Arya preferred to trust. Lady, the fiddler began in a voice that had been trained to throw across courtyards. We are the Winter Road Players, which is to say we are 7 people who once had a 10th and now find that we are less. We come not for generosity, though we would welcome it, not for safety, though we would not scorn it, but to lay a thing before a lord's eyes. He peered past her at the fire as if it might applause. Lady, we can juggle and we can sing, and we can tell a story that will make a man itch in his boots, and another that will make a woman remember when her skirts were new. We can pull a coin from a child's ear and make a dog howl with a string and a bent nail. But tonight we only wish to give you this. He reached into his coat and produced a packet wrapped in oilcloth. It was too carefully wrapped to be a trick. He held it with both hands as if it might bite. There was no seal. There was a faint smell of salt about it that did not belong to the kitchen. He set it on the table and stepped back. Tamsin had moved before Arya could, sliding a knife into her hand with a gesture so practiced that it might have been something like turning down a bed. Arya cut the string, peeled back the oilcloth, and found inside a sheet of paper that had been folded too many times and a small square of cloth. The cloth was deep green and rough woven, and there was a stitched edge of brown. The paper had a single shape drawn on it in ink that had feathered a little with damp. A reed bent at the top and under it a /Lee. A crossbar, as if a person had been walking over ice and left a mark. Arya stared for a long moment. The world came to a still, precise point and the sounds in the hall arranged themselves around it. The soft hiss of fire, the brief ring of a cup set down too hard on wood, the faint tap of Remy's ring against the parchment he wore like a second robe. She did not look at the fiddler. She did not look at anyone else. Who gave you this? She asked. The fiddler voice, trained as it was to fill spaces, cut itself smaller at the edges. A man by the river 2 days west of Barrowton, he said. He had a voice that was not from any of the places I have learned to place. He told us to carry this to the Lady of Winterfell and to ask her to keep it hidden until she wished to be asked for it. He did not pay well. He had very dark eyes. What did he look like? Arya asked, not caring what a foolish question it might be. People manage to describe things poorly when asked too loosely and sometimes wonderfully when asked badly. Like a man trying not to be a tree, the fiddler said after a moment. If you planted him, he would give you shade. But he would not say whose shade you were in. She laughed, surprised by it, and it did not sound like her father's laugh or her sister's. It sounded like a small bark from her own throat. She stood, folded the cloth again, and then once more until it was small enough to disappear into the pocket sewn inside her skirt, and then tapped the paper twice with the tip of the knife and slid it toward Remy's because he would find a way to say all the things she did not wish to say out loud. Feed them, she said to Tamsin, and find them beds in the bearguard room. They are not quick to complain about straw. Tell them that if they play, they will be given coin, and if they do not play, they will be given bread. Tell them that if anyone offers them a job between here and the East Road, they should refuse it and keep walking. The fiddler smiled and bowed again, this time carefully with no feet trod on. The woman whose foot had been trod on smoothed her skirt and looked at Arya as if she could see the cloth through 2 layers of wool and the skin below. The lad with the ears had already found a way to put a whole slice of bread in his mouth. His eyes shone with both delight and a new understanding of his own limits. Arya turned and walked toward the stairs. She did not run. She climbed and turned and climbed and turned, hearing behind her the swell and fall of voices that marked meat pie and small beer and men telling a joke they had already told 3 times today. The room was where she had left it, and the chest held what it had held. She sat on the bed and took out the cloth again and unfolded it slowly, as if someone might be watching from the space between the plaster and the stones. The green was the particular shade of reeds in late summer, when the tops are brown and the stems are sweet. The brown thread at the edge had been sewn by a hand that did not care overmuch for tidy corners. She put it to her nose, closed her eyes, and breathed. The scent was faint but unmistakable. The clean, green, damp smell of a place where a person can step on grass that floats and leave no print. On the paper, in a hand she did not recognize and yet nearly did, there was another line written lower down, so light it might have been drawn with watered ink. In the reeds, a debt. She turned the sheet over. The other side was blank. She thought of a man by a river who would not say whose shade he offered. She thought of a face without features in a ditch and a brother boasting in the middle of fear. She thought of boys making their feet obey their thoughts. She thought of goats and women and men who took apples and remembered only the sweetness on their own tongues. She folded the paper again, folded the cloth, tucked both away. She did not need to decide what she would do tonight. A person can only live so many lives in one day, and yet decisions arrive as softly as snowfall. They do not always announce their weight when they land. In the corridor outside, she could hear someone coming. The steps were steady and measured and did not hurry. She knew them. Remy's knocked, 3 light taps as if he did not wish to bruise the air. She opened. "Forgive the hour," he said, though it was not yet late. "There is something else." "There is always something else," she said, not unkindly. "A raven from the Dreadfort," Remy said, and it was the sort of sentence that can change the temperature of a room. "It is not marked by Lord Bolton's hand, which means it must come from someone who wishes the lady to know he has friends where he should not. It says only that the snows have made men easy to follow, and that there are boots that leave strange marks when men think they walk alone." "Strange how?" she asked. "Too many nails in the heel," he said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps too few. It depends on what one expects. It also says that a boy has been missing since the first freeze and his mother has gone to speak to the old stones, and the old stones have said nothing. I cannot tell if the ink says more than that. Sometimes ink says too much for my comfort." "Thank you," she said. "Tell Lon. Tell him to send a man he trusts to the edge of the old road tomorrow. I want eyes that see and do not speak until they come back inside. And tell the kitchen to keep soup on the fire throughout the night. There will be someone who comes in from cold and will not say they need soup until someone puts it in their hands." Remy's nodded. Then he hesitated, a rare sign he had encountered a corner, he meant to turn carefully. "Lady," he said, "you have done well to be lady today." She lifted a hand to stop him saying more, not because she did not want to hear it, but because it frightened her more than any ugly report of feet in the snow. "If I haven't, there's nothing to be done for it tonight. In the M.O. Renning, I will try again." When he had gone, she stood a long moment in the corridor, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the stones cool under her feet through the leather of her boots. She turned and made the long walk down to the crypts because that was what she did when her mind was a door with too many locks. The path was unlit. A torch should have been carried and was not. She knew the turns, the change in the air where the walls narrowed, the exact feel of the step that had sunk a fraction when she was a child and had not been repaired because it offended no one. She stopped at the statue with her father's face. It was a face the sculptor had carved with more piety than skill, and she loved it because it had not gotten him right. The wrongness let her fill in the rest. She laid her hand on the stone knee and felt the cold. She did not say very much. She never did. She only said enough to make the silence in her chest change its nature. "Tonight," she said, "I am doing it. It is hard and also not hard at all. I want to be what I was and what I am and something I have not yet made. Tell me what I am doing is not shameful." When she lifted her hand, there was a kind of peace tucked in the palm that had not been there before. She left it there. She made her way back through the dark, counting steps she did not need to count. In the hall again, the players were beginning to tune their fiddle and their voices. The man with the hat who had warmed his feet in water had gone, just as Lon had said. His stool was empty but kept warm for his return by proximity to the fire. The widow's sheep were tied at the post and Jared was not looking at them because he had learned to remember. Bess's onion and vinegar had been set out with the pies, and the men pretended to scowl and then ate 3 helpings. Tamsin's slate lay on the table with the last words she had written. Boots, nails, East Road. Remy's had tucked away his ravens. Arya found herself a place near the edge of the fire where she could see everything without being expected to be the center of anything. She sat and folded her hands and let the warmth touch the front of her shins. She breathed once, twice, and then she let the day ebb a little at the edges. The fiddler played, and his bow was better than his voice. A woman with him sang a song about a girl who had loved a boy who had been made into a tree, and the refrain wrapped around the beams and came back to fall on people's heads like soft snow. In the middle of the second verse, the boy with ears laughed suddenly in delight at a harmonized twist that had likely been accidental. Arya felt herself smile. Later, when the candles had been snuffed and the stir of bed-making had made its long whisper and the guards had been posted, she stood for a moment at her window and watched the sky. It was a clear night now. The cold had tightened. The stars were more many than seemed decent. Somewhere in that wide dark there was a man wearing a face not his, walking a road that did not belong to him. Somewhere there was a man by a river who wanted to be a tree and who had sent her a cloth to tuck into her pocket and a word that meant promise or threat or both. Somewhere the neck sang and fell silent and sang again. She let the world be that big and herself that small. She slid into bed and pulled the furs up and lay on her side, listening for the small crooked sounds a keep makes when it has decided to sleep. When sleep came, it came without dreams for a while, like a patient animal that settles beside you on the floor and does not put its head on your feet until you have forgotten to expect it. Then a dream flickered, not unwelcome, not entirely kind either. Reeds bending, a set of chalk lines on a floor, a boy's hand with too few nails or too many. Her hand closed around a hilt that was no heavier than a thought. The heart tree watched with red eyes, and its mouth did not move, and from it came a voice that was not a voice but the shape of cold on the inner skin. Be who you are today. That will be enough to reach tomorrow. She woke before dawn again because she always did. The keys hung in their loop like a question. She would have to lift them. She would have to decide whether the lady would stay in the keep or cross the yard and go to the stables and choose a horse with a dark mane and a steady, secret heart. She stood a moment with her hand on the wood of the door, and then she took it away and went to the window and looked out on the yard where the steam was rising. The rime had etched delicate ferns on the glass, each one a path to another decision. She pressed her thumb into the frost and left the shape of a leaf there again. And then she turned and took the keys from their hook, feeling their weight slide into her palm like something earned and not given. The day was ready to be made, and she was ready to make it, slowly, carefully, with a hand that knew the first use of a knife is not cutting but sometimes pointing and sometimes just reminding you where your hand ends and the world begins.